Zoey Greco, intuitive mentor, numerologist, and spiritual support system to women everywhere currently overthinking a text message.
Girl, just send it already.
She's been called too sensitive, too emotional, too much, and somehow turned it into a career.
God forbid women have hobbies.
Now she's helping you discover and develop your intuitive power to hop timelines into your dream life.
Higher Self Hotline. Oh, this one's for you.
From numerology forecasts to spiritual hot takes and definitely some oversharing, this is
Higher Self Hotline.
Your direct line to the divine. Hello, divine darlings, and welcome back to the Higher Self Hotline. I'm your host, Zoey Greco. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I have to tell you, I personally feel like today is the materialization and culmination of a lifelong dream. I am so thrilled to bring you today's guest. This is someone whose work has impacted my life, whose work was handed to me through my mother. We are lifelong fans, and I am so incredibly honored today to introduce all of you to Dr. Judith Orloff. And let me tell you for a moment just a little bit about Dr. Orloff. Dr. Orloff is a New York Times bestselling author whose books include The Genius of Empathy, The Empath Survival Guide, and Thriving as an Empath, which presents daily self-care tools for sensitive people like us. A UCLA psychiatric clinical faculty member, she blends the pearls of conventional medicine with cutting-edge knowledge of intuition, empathy, and energy. Dr. Orloff specializes in treating highly sensitive people in her private practice and online internationally. Her work has been featured on The Today Show, CNN, Oprah Magazine, The New York Times, and USA Today, among many others. Dr. Orloff, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on.
I have to say, growing up as a highly sensitive person and an empath, it was always a priority for my mother for her to find any sort of resource that existed in this world for those of us that needed to be not only validated, but directed in how to take care of ourselves and how to nurture ourselves as highly sensitive people. I feel so grateful for that experience. But I know that from reading Second Sight, that's actually not an experience that you yourself had. In fact, your parents, who were both physicians, really discouraged you and maybe even forbade you from sharing your insights and your experiences as an empathetic or intuitive child. Can you speak a little bit to that experience of growing up without support?
Oh, yes. So Second Sight was my very first book that I wrote, kind of a coming out of saying I'm a psychiatrist, I am intuitive, and I'm an empath. And I combine traditional medicine with all of these. And so it was kind of my coming out book, where I began talking about my childhood, where I had two physician parents. I have many physicians in my family. And I was a little girl who can know things and see things. And I was very quiet. I wasn't really, that conversational in, let's say, social situations. And I would know things about my parents' friends when I was growing up, and I would tell them, and they would say, "Oh dear, how can you say such negative things about the people I care about?" And so that made me feel like there was something wrong with me. That what is wrong? I'm saying these horrible things. Things like this person is depressed. Or there was one time I picked up that one of their friends was going to make a suicide attempt. And I'm a child, mind you, so I don't really know much about all this. But I did remember the look in my mother's eyes when I would say things like, and share intuitions, and it was nothing that I wanted to see. And so finally she said, never mention another one of your dreams or intuitions again at home. So I was forbidden to speak about them growing up because they were too upsetting. And so I kept them all to myself, which in and of itself is a huge feat. And it's not anything I would suggest for people listening. You need to have some kind of an outlet. You need to have at least one person who's going to understand you. And these days, there's resources all over the place. much more so than when I was growing up. There was zero resources, at least that I knew of. And so, I grew up thinking there was something wrong with me. And the second sight is my story and how I came from that perspective to coming into my gifts and realizing that in order to be whole, I had to incorporate my intuition. I had to incorporate empathy and all of its wonderful forms of powerful expressions. And I had to do that. I had in order to be whole. And so that has been my journey, making that decision at that point. And then day by day, week by week, throughout the years, as I've gone through 14 years of medical training, and, I learned all kinds of amazing traditional medical skills, in addition to incorporating intuition and empathy. As I talk about in the genius of empathy, I think empathy is a genius. It's to be able to feel with our hearts and not take on energy and absorb it into our bodies, in terms of getting drained. Learning how to work with empathy and be able to feel it and share it and build an environment that's based on it, but not have our bodies take it on. This is a big skill, very important. It's something I teach in the genius of empathy, and really, in all my classes, because if you're an empath, this is one skill you need to learn. You can't get away with absorbing everything you come into contact with. It's just our bodies are too porous and too sensitive to withstand that. And that's okay. So you learn tools, and you learn how not to take on people's stuff, and you learn when you're triggered or when you feel guilty. Then you do it. You have to look at your own patterns. And what I love about being an empath and what I've written about it is that it causes so much insight. We get so much insight into ourselves, so much healing, and we get better and better at being able to center ourselves in the midst of chaos, in the midst of grief, in the midst of everything we all go through at various points in our lives. To learn how to do that and really work with our own energies, which is quite empowering.
I relate so deeply to your childhood experience, not in the way that I was parented or the way that my gifts were received. And I speak about that often, that I feel very fortunate to have had so much support. And I feel like my mother really worked very hard to preserve my personhood and to support me in being a sensitive person in a world that's pretty sharp and angular and pokey. But I think there's something so powerful about, you described second sight as your coming out, and absolutely, especially because, in the time, I believe you started publishing in the 90s, correct? Like around 96?
Yes.
So at that time, these conversations were not happening. And the idea of being in the field of psychiatry, no less, and saying, I feel things and I hear things and I see things. It's a dangerous place to speak that out, especially. It's not like it's we're not talking about, internal medicine. We're talking about psychiatry. So it's a very dangerous place for you to have done that. But you described it as needing to live your truth and realizing that your wholeness was the only way that you were going to be able to live with yourself. But also, I love that in honoring your true self, you ended up providing such a generous gift and lineage in the books that you've written and the work that you share, because it truly has contributed, if not shaped and initiated, the conversation that we're able to have about empathy as, a topic of mainstream self-understanding. So that's the first thing I wanted to just say, is I really recognize your contributions. And as an empath myself, I'm extremely grateful. And I also remember reading in, I believe also Second Sight, you talked about a deathbed sort of confession or revelation that your mother offered you. And I would love if you could share with listeners a little bit about that experience and how it moved you forward in your path.
Oh, yes. That was a section that I wrote on my mother's death, and what it was like being there and what she shared with me. But basically, she revealed at that point in time that we came from a whole lineage of psychic healers, where my grandmother was a healer. and a number of the women on our side of the family were healers. And she didn't want to tell me that before that time because she didn't want people to think I was weird. She didn't want my medical career to be sabotaged. She didn't, she was just very overly protective. I was an only child, and she just wanted the best for me, but really went way overboard with it. However, that was her choice. And so I found my own way. And I think when she saw that my way was a good way and that it really suited my temperament and my needs and being able to help people in the world, she felt more comfortable with some of my decisions because I really have lived the road less traveled most of my life. And it's how I like it. Way. I don't need to go in the center of things with lots of people. Like in a movie theater, as an empath, I go sit up in the right-hand corner and away from everybody. I don't go in the middle of that movie theater. That would be too much, too much energy there. So my mother saw that I was, communicating and doing really well, in what I was doing with my work and all kinds of ways. And so she told me as she was dying that we came from a lineage of healers, and she wanted me to know that. She wanted the circle to be complete before she went. And it was shocking because that was, I was grown up by then, a lot of time had passed that she kept that a secret. And so when she told me, I was wondering so many things like, why didn't you tell me earlier? Can't you see, how things turned out? And she just was so protective. And so my heart went out to her, my compassion went out. And I was ever so grateful that at least she finally did it. And she finally did that with me, because that's an important piece of information for me, the circle of women, in my family who had these abilities. That's important to me to know and to feel in a community of ancestors.
Wow. As an empath, we should do a count, everybody. Have a little cookie every time we say empath in this episode. But I really deeply, profoundly relate to that. And what you just described, the compassion you were able to access for your mother, understanding that she made the choices she made out of love with the best of intentions, but not necessarily providing the impact that, could have been the most supportive to you. I hear that and I think immediately, wow, your empathy is so strong. But you do talk about the difference between empathy and being an empath. And I'm wondering if you can help listeners understand that distinction, because I feel like the word has been a little misused, misappropriated, and misunderstood over the years. And I feel like we need to hear it from the mouth of the mother of empaths.
Oh gosh, the empathy I look at as a spectrum, and the genius of empathy is about empathy. It's about being an empath, and it's about how to combine the two, depending on how deep you want to go. I like to go really deep, so that's just my preference. But not everybody has to do that, so it's perfectly fine to do it your own way. And so being an empath is about being highly sensitive to all kinds of sensory stimuli, noise, smells, sounds, nature sounds, all the different variations of sensory stimuli, and our ability to feel all of that deeply, in addition to being connected to nature, being connected to our deepest hearts, wanting to be of service to others in the world. That's very strong in empaths, is wanting to help, a love of animals, a love of plants, communication with, species other than humans, and, just the ability to do that. And the desire, maybe to be with just a few people instead of lots of people at once, just having a preference to have tea with a friend versus going to a Rolling Stones concert at a stadium.
Sure.
And one is not better than another. It's just a preference. No, I'm not making a value judgment. So, empaths are people who have very strong empathy, but they tend to become emotional sponges, and they take on the stress of others or the world, unless they learn certain skills. And that's what the genius of empathy is about, is how do you stand strong in the world, centered, not absorbing, and be able to enjoy yourself and make really wise choices about energy in the world. You have to learn about energy if you're an empath. You have to learn, what feels good in your body. You've got to listen to your body. You've got to be in touch with that. You have to see what raises your energy, what zaps your energy, you have to be honest with yourself. What people do you feel good around? Which people do you, kind of feel not so good around? And does your energy go down? So these are all aspects of being an empath. Empathy on a spectrum is that, people have regular empathy where they go through life. If something good is shared by a friend, let's say, you can feel their happiness. No, let's say they have a baby and they're thrilled about that. You could feel that happiness in your own body. And so it's a very positive thing because you can be with people on a feeling level. But that's not the same as being an empath. It's about feeling where another person is at. That's empathy. Being an empath is way high up on the empathy spectrum in terms of what you can sense, what you can feel, levels of enjoyment in terms of colors and weather and animals and all kinds of things that other people might not be that interested in, or you could stay there forever because it's just fascinating.
Dear Angel, your radiant presence is requested and frankly overdue at my monthly pajama party. Every third Sunday of the month, I open a virtual room and spend the morning pulling cards, reading auras, talking numerology, answering questions, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, and exploring whatever spiritual rabbit hole captures the collective attention that day. Dress code, your coziest, cutest pajamas. Don't be afraid to overdress. Refreshments will include coffee, matcha, and the occasional emotional breakthrough. It's free, it's every third Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific, and it is, without question, the most magical gathering of the month. Please RSVP at zoegreco.com. Can't wait to see you there. XO Zoey. There's been this conversation over the last several years where the term empath has been sort of like memeified. And by that, I mean, it's like become a bit of the butt of a joke, which I don't personally resonate with. And I find that there's been a lot of conversation about the psychology of being an empath. And basically people are suggesting that the idea of being an empath is actually just a person who's experienced a lot of trauma or volatility or instability in their growing environment and developed this sort of like hypervigilance to, preempt and predict. And I've had such a difficult time engaging in that conversation because unless you truly are an empath, I think it's very difficult to help people understand that. I mean, very much in the way that like you're born with a sexual preference, right? It's like I was born an empath. Now, was being in, childhood instability, did it contribute to my pattern recognition? Perhaps. Probably, I would say yes. But I do believe that the skill set predates the experience that I had. Like the innate nature predates the experiences that I had. I'm curious because you are in the field of mental health and psychology and psychiatry. If you can sort of speak to the skeptics who take that perspective or what your thoughts are on that conversation.
Well, there are always so many nuances to human behavior. But I've heard that argument too, that people feel that empaths always come from a traumatic background. And I don't agree with that at all. I think sometimes it's true. It's definitely true. You've been raised in an alcoholic home. You've been raised with neglect or abuse, and you're beaten, and you're, not given food, or whatever, the suffering that goes on, in some of the households. And what that does is that breaks down some of our barriers. And so the sensitivities are exposed. It's like a wire without insulation. And so you do go towards being an empath, the kind of empath who is very open to things, but doesn't know how to reflect or block things out. And so that can come from trauma. But, as you said, some people were born empaths, not all people. I was born an empath, so that was kind of the path that I recall. I recall situations in the womb. I can go back. I've been taken back, and it was an analysis once, and we went back into the womb, and I had some, pretty intense experiences there. But being an empath, it can go back to that. It can be your temperament, just that you come out with. You could have an empathic temperament, or, you can have trauma associated with it. But what I'm hearing, and the argument I've heard that you're bringing up, is that they're trying to pigeonhole empaths to be just one thing. And that's not my experience. As a physician and as somebody who's treated empaths for 30 years, now each person is different. You have to talk to each person. You have to find out what their history is. You have to find out what their birth history is, which is, really important. And many therapists don't talk about that. Now, what was it like being born into this world? Was it traumatic? I mean, because you could have trauma just early on like that, or was it, a different kind of birth? Like I was born a C-section, and
I was as well.
You were, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a whole different experience because you don't struggle down the birth canal. You don't get those muscles. You're just lifted out, and there you are here on Earth without any preparation. Yeah. So it's just a various histories of people, and I encourage all the healthcare practitioners out there, or those who are patients, to try and find practitioners that will get this, and will understand, about you being an empath and not trying to just pigeonhole it into trauma. But there's a bit of a punitive sense about that. When I've heard that, or I've seen that on the internet, it's a bit.
I agree.
They're phonies because it's really trauma. And, that is not an energy that I'm at all interested in, because it's not compassionate. And it's not seeing the many nuances that cause things in people, or what I've seen, like during the pandemic, many people came out as empaths when they never were before. And they're adults because there was so much stress, so much unknown, so many things happening that their senses got stripped. So they got more sensitive. During that time. And, there's all these things going on the news, and people just have a very hard time when, they're not familiar with any techniques to deal with their empathy, where they're just watching the news all the time. And so they feel horrible. They're absorbing all the stress and negative energy and violence. So, they need a lot more guidance than they're getting, because, sometimes people just go into the empathic realm and they don't know how they got there.
Yeah.
Or they put two and two together. So my point is that there are all kinds of reasons why people are an empath. And I hope everybody can respect that in each individual, because you can't really generalize. It doesn't do anyone justice to generalize. And I know as an empath, if I went to a physician or whatever situation I had, people would say, well, you're the only one who's ever felt that way. So I never understood why that's such a profound statement to people. No, you're the only one, as if it doesn't exist just because you're the only one. You're the only, you come into my private practice and I sit with you and you're telling me something. You're saying the sky looks yellow or purple to me. I'm not going to say you're the only one who ever felt that way. I'm going to say, wow, tell me about it. Wow. Now, what's your experience of the world? I want to hear about you and your experience. And if that's your experience, so be it.
As you're describing this, it's so interesting because your response to the skepticism and the conversation, which you're right, it's punitive, it's belittling, I think, in a lot of ways to the ability, which is why I wanted to bring this up to you. I find that your response to it is exactly what I would expect of an empath. It's so compassionate. It's focused on the soul journey of the individual, the lived experience of the individual. It is filled with heart-centeredness, and it is in such deep recognition of the person themselves. And empathy and being an empath is quite an interesting thing, right? Because I feel like on one hand, we're almost predisposed to being extraordinarily plugged into the collective, feeling the oneness of everything. That's what we're feeling, right? It's like, oh, like I can literally transmit my consciousness to someone across the world, to an animal in a forest, anywhere. Like I can feel the vibration of the earth itself. Mm-hmm. It's a very profound thing. And yet there's this beauty in the human experience of the individualistic path. And I love that your empathetic approach recognizes the individual in their experience. So honestly, it's the only type of care I think an empath could benefit from. And yet there are not enough caregivers, physicians, mental health professionals, people in the caregiving and, the service world that serve from that perspective or that identity of being an empath. So to be honest, I'm not at all surprised by your response, but I am really lit up and activated and inspired by it because it's just so so unusual and uncommon in the world that we live in. So that response is actually stunning and grounding. And yet my soul feels like a deep recognition of your words.
Oh, thank you. I would suggest for everyone to just be able to listen individually to a person and not try and lump them into a category. As I know in psychiatry, we tend to do that. We have the DSM-4 and we put everybody in diagnoses, major depression, anxiety disorder. And, there's some commonalities, but people can never fit into a box. I mean, that's never going to happen. But you can take what's good and then discard the rest. Now you don't want to just say, this is terrible and this is great. You try and see what's good in something and say, how can that be useful to me? And take that and then apply it. As opposed to just, no, if you're not this way, you're not right. And being an empath, if people, everyone who's listening here, I think in your audience, they identify with being an empath. But for those people who might not, that's fine. I have no investment in whether people identify as empaths or not. It doesn't make any difference to me, but I do want people to be happy. So whatever they choose, I hope they're happy with it. And I don't care whether you're an empath.
My heart is in such resonance with you, Dr. Orloff. I truly am a fan of your work. I've read the majority of your books. Especially as an empath caring for empaths, I think you've created a lot of resources that are imperative and important. And you've talked a couple times about empaths being sponge-like. And I always talk to my clients about mastering the art and the differentiation between observation and absorption, because empaths do, I think, really benefit from data points. I think for me personally, I always would start my intuitive sessions with clients by asking them a little bit about what's happening in their world, not because I felt like I needed necessarily like some inside information, but the data point activated my empathetic ability, like listening to the timbre of their voice even. It allowed me to kind of feel into this like emotional Rolodex that I've built through my own lived experience and collected through working with other people. And it took me some time in my life to learn the difference between observing all of those things, cataloging them, categorizing them, collecting them without absorbing them. And I found that your book, The Empath Survival Guide, was a very, very useful tool. Also, The Genius of Empathy is like really, these resources have been absolutely imperative in self-understanding and also helping people who identify as empaths or HSPs, highly sensitive people, in self-preservation. So I'm curious if you can talk about, at least for you, what supported you most in being able to find the difference and distinction between observation and absorption, or perhaps what you've seen work most effectively in your clients.
Well, I like to have high energy. I really love high energy. And so I'm a student of what drains my energy. I look around, at people or situations, or if I walk into a room and I'm not comfortable with the vibes in the room, I'm very sensitive to energy. And so it's very important to me to know what brings my energy up and what brings it down. And if I'm in a situation where I can't leave at the moment and I need to center myself, how do I do that? What technique do I use? And, observe, don't absorb, of course, is the motto of an empath. And, it's something that you could work towards, but you need to have the awareness, first of all, of what's happening and how your body is reacting in certain circumstances, and not to judge yourself over that. As I know, empaths often have these very judgmental minds, and they talk themselves out of a perfectly good intuition, that's going to save you and save the night. And you're saying, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that way. It's not real. I'm a hypochondriac or whatever the negative things you say to yourself in your head. Everybody said, don't worry about it. Everybody says things, but learning how to say, I'm not listening to that right now. I'm listening to my intuition. What does my body say here? And how can I act on it immediately so I can have a good time tonight? And so I usually go off into the bathroom or outside on the front yard or wherever I am, to just have some quiet time to gather myself together and decide intuitively what I want to do. And, and this is especially useful. And this is in the Empath Survival Guide, talking about energy vampires. If you're at a gathering and somebody's really getting to you and draining you, you could just take a little bit of time off, or they're triggering you for some reason. You don't know why at the moment, you're just there, but you notice it. And so you can go out on the front yard, close your eyes, put your hand on your heart, tune in to get to your center, and just ask yourself, what is it, intuitively that's triggering me? And, it could be as simple as, this person reminds me of my sister and she's triggered. And, or whatever, you get some kind of awareness. You go, oh, okay. All right. So I can let her be. I don't need to take it personally. And so you can go back in the room and she doesn't bother you anymore, and she's not draining you, and she might doing all the same things, but you're not triggered. See, if you're personally triggered, then you're more attached to what the person is doing or not doing, and you're working yourself up in terms of whatever we do as humans and judging others. But, you don't want to do that. So what I do is just to find out what's triggering me, take a breath, tell myself, all right, put it in a box until later. This is a bigger subject than right now. And then, go about my business. So I don't focus on them the whole time, or bother me. I love when you're bothered by people, that usually means triggered by something.
As I'm listening to this and kind of like reflecting on this response, I feel like so many people that I've encountered that resist their intuitive ability or their empathetic ability do so because they identify it as burdensome. And first of all, your response just now really brought to mind just how simple the practice can be to unburden yourself. It can be as simple as a check-in, asking yourself a question, putting something in a box, not forever, but for a moment, so that you can take it out and unpack it at a more appropriate, safe, emotionally resonant opportunity. And the thing that I find so interesting in speaking with you, because like I said, I've read your books, I'm a fan, but in actually getting to have a conversation, you really embody something that I think is very important and exemplary in the world of empathy and in empaths understanding themselves, which is I hear no victimhood whatsoever in what you are sharing. I hear no sense that your ability is burdensome. And even in, sharing of being forbidden from sharing your insights as a child, from having to come out in an industry and a profession that doesn't necessarily, that certainly doesn't support your findings and your lived experience, there's so much you've actually had to overcome. And yet I don't hear the energy of victimhood in your story anywhere. Even in your recollections of it, there was just none of that. And I hear you talking about remaining and staying in a high vibration, but at the same time, to me, it doesn't feel like bypassing. It feels like a real intentional choice and decision. I'm curious, what has been the most supportive for you in distancing yourself from victimhood around your identity as an empath, or if that just came naturally to you so the world could benefit from your example?
No, I'm a great fan of doing personal work. As I've been in therapy off and on my whole life, I've worked with so many different people that have helped me and helped me get clear. And at this point in my life, I see my life as a gift. That I was able to go on a path of my passion, and I've been able, especially with writing, because I'm my happiest moments are when I'm alone in a room writing my books. I just feel so blessed to be able to write and to have the time, because life can steal those moments. They can tear you in many directions, and that I've had a lot of time in this lifetime to write and get my my beliefs about empaths and how to help people down on paper and to be able to go on book tours and talk to people and have lots of time to lecture. I look at this as a tremendous gift to me. That this lifetime was this for me, and they gave it to me. They gave me my deepest wish. And so I'm really grateful for it.
Oh, I'm so moved by that response. It's so beautiful. And I feel the same way. It's like, what a gift. Oh, when you said those words, when you said my life is such a gift, I immediately moved to tears. And I hope that anyone who's listening to this conversation who identifies as an empath or believes that you may be, or feels that you might be deep down and you don't feel safe to bring those gifts forward, I hope that you can hear the sincerity with which Dr. Orloff is speaking about this. Like this, I feel it. And the tears are coming from the empathy, right? Like from the empath. I'm resonating so deeply with what you're sharing. I feel it as if it's my own joy. And I want everyone out there to experience the liberation of self-acceptance like this, and also the gift of their own lived experience. I want everyone to be able to feel the way that Dr. Orloff feels, that your life is a gift.
Everybody is different, though, and everybody can feel however they feel. And if you're going through victim stage and you're truly hurt and betrayed and you're feeling that, you want to heal that. You want to deal with that. And you don't just get from victim to this is a gift. Like, overnight. That doesn't happen that way. It's, you pray to have that. And, there are all kinds of ways people might disrespect you for being an empath if they think it's woo-woo. I had an experience just in everyday life. I'm a big fan of everyday life and the humor in it. It's just it's so ridiculous to me. But I was living in a condo and I was having terrible time with my HOA, just horrible big fees and there was acoustic problems. I'm not going to get into it, but the man above me wrote me this letter, and he called me, and she calls herself an alleged empath. I find that the most hysterical thing. He was an attorney, and he was trying to identify me. She's an alleged empath. I thought, gotta go. This is it. And it's just so funny to me. It's just hilarious to me how some people, they think they're trying to get you, and it just turns out so funny. He didn't mean it.
He didn't mean it to be, but I love that you were able to turn it into something that you could laugh at. And you're right. Everyone is entitled to feel their own feeling. My hope is that we can all reach that place of self-acceptance and feeling that life is a gift. But what you've identified there and what you've, circled back to is so important. This idea that deeply allowing ourselves to meet each feeling that we have on our journey is how we eventually move toward that sense of fulfillment. And, one of the things that I think is so powerful about the work that you're doing is you've written all these incredible resources. You teach, you share, you guide. We're in such receptivity from you. And yet you decided to take it a step further and write a book for children, which I think is honestly a timeline shift for the collective, for us to begin to speak to children about their gifts lovingly. Because when I was little, like I said, right, like we're watching this, right? So your experience was you were forbidden from experiencing your gifts. I was supported, but my mother was unresourced. And now you're creating the resources. So can you tell us about your children's book that came out last year?
This is called The Highly Sensitive Rabbit. And it's about a highly sensitive rabbit named Aurora, my nickname, by the way, as an adult. It's about me. It's about my...
It's my autobiography.
It is, but it's about a highly sensitive rabbit named Aurora who lives in the Sonoran Desert, which is just south of Tucson, and with beautiful desert scapes. And the illustration is gorgeous, and everybody makes fun of her. Her brothers, call her a crybaby. Nobody understands her, and she just wants to go look at the moon, at night. And it's just on her own all the time. And then they end up losing their home. And then she ends up meeting these other animals who give her tips on how to be an empath, an empathic rabbit. and how to take care of herself. And in the meantime, she makes these friends. And then, she learns how to embrace her gift and really honor them. So that's the short story. I'm not going to give away what happens inside the book.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
Guys, go buy it. The Highly Sensitive Rabbit, guys. Buy it for the inner child and everyone you love and the actual children in your life, because I can't even tell you what kind of resources, like what those kinds of resources could have done for me growing up. And in fact, Dr. Orloff, you don't know this, but my license plate is Crybaby. I always call myself a certified card carrying crybaby. And it's a title I wear proudly. I cry pretty much on every episode of the show. And I think that being in touch with our emotions is a profound privilege. And at the same time, it is something that we are ridiculed for and isolated for and because of. And I really think that helping children understand from an early age that there are safe places and there are practices and safe people that can help you build that inner stability, to find strength in the gift versus like the weight of being misunderstood. So on behalf of my own inner child, I want to just say thank you for sharing your story and being so willing to tell it to all of us in all the different ways that you have, whether it's from, your books for adults or your books for children, because it's such an important pivotal shift that will allow consciousness to, I think, be expedited toward deeper empathy and understanding.
Yes, well, I wrote the book because the children will inherit the world. We'll only be here so long, but they're going to the ones that at a pivotal time are going to take over. So you want them to be in good shape. You want them to understand their sensitivities and be stewards for the earth, because empathic children naturally feel that way towards animals and the earth. It's not a big debate in their head whether it exists or not. It just is a very natural way to be. And so I want the children to be ready, and to feel good about themselves when they take over, when they grow up a little bit. And then they're going to be the ones, that generation.
Wow. It's so incredible. I know we have just a little bit of time left, and I have so many other questions that I want to ask you. But, one of the things that you talk a lot about is empaths in relationships, which I think is a subject that we could have an entire additional hour-long plus conversation about. But, there's a pattern that so many empaths recognize in themselves, where they're drawn again and again to partners who are emotionally unavailable. We also have been, having this conversation where we're discovering that empaths and narcissists tend to be drawn toward one another. And we're not here to pathologize any specific individuals, but to say that there's this pattern where empaths seek those who are emotionally unavailable or end up feeling suffocated once they're finally in a relationship. I would love to discuss what's happening beneath the surface and why this pattern seems to be so pervasive, especially in empaths. And before we answer the question, I just would love to share too that, in my own life, I'm happily married. I have been with my husband for 13 years. We've been married for 10 this year. And he could not be a safer, softer, more perfect place for me. Someone who truly embraces my emotion. I have never felt shame for crying. I've never felt shame for any part of myself. And at the same time, the love that he has for me overwhelms me deeply on like a physical level. Like I'm overwhelmed sometimes by physical intimacy or emotional intimacy. It can feel so big to a sensitive person. So I'm curious, there's sort of this dichotomy that empaths experience, right? Where we're either drawn to emotional unavailability or we're overwhelmed. Can you help us understand why these things happen to those of us who are empaths?
That's a very important topic. In the Empath Survival Guide, there's a chapter that deals with this, and different people you might be attracted to in relationships, whether you're attracted to other empaths, or you're attracted to rocks type people like I am. People are very solid rocks. No, I could never be with another empath. It would be way overwhelming for me. But you see, that's all right. You see, I prefer the rock. Like my partner is rock-like, and he's just there. He shows up, and that's such an amazing quality for me. I love that. He's there, and he could listen to me express myself, especially when I get on overload. And he can say, I think it's time, you go take some alone time. We could discuss this later, but he's that type. But not everybody needs to be in a relationship. First of all, I want to make that really clear it's a particular spiritual path, an empathic path that's extremely challenging. And I would say in my life, of all the topics I've dealt with, probably it was one of the most challenging for me.
Wow.
Because I, for a long time would have relationships with people who live across the country, as a way of not getting overloaded or different things. And, I finally was ready to be with somebody who was available, and somebody who wanted to be with me and wasn't afraid of my whatever, fill in the blank. And we could have fun together and be companions. But I've had to work on so many of my issues, in terms of being able to assert my needs rather than run away. To assert my needs, I need to be alone now. I need to not talk about this. I'm not able to absorb this right now. To be able to speak up, and say, if his tone of voice feels snappy to me and I don't like it, I'll ask him to say things in a nicer way, and even say, just say, I love you, but I'm not able to have this discussion right now. To be able to educate each other, and to have it's very important for those listening to have somebody who's willing to listen to you and who loves you and wants to work with us. Yes, you don't want somebody criticizing you. You don't want to be in a relationship with somebody who says, oh, you're an empath. Oh, really? Or, with snide remarks, and it's not worth it. Stay alone.
Wow. I think that's a really interesting perspective to take, that not every person can thrive or maybe belongs in a relational dynamic like that, or unless we can find one that is supportive to our nature.
Yes, or even without that last sentence, you just don't want to be in a relationship in this lifetime. You want to have, your retreats. You want to go on silent retreats. You want to be with your friends. You don't want to have the challenges that come up in relationship, because there's so many of them. And it's a path I chose. I really wanted it. I was really drawn to it. And I wanted to have a close, loving relationship in this lifetime that, we're together now 13 years. And that's, for me, a record. I used to be at most in relationship at 3 years, and then it would break, it just some kind of block. But, if you want to be in a relationship, then you do it consciously, and you try and find somebody who has a bit of emotional intelligence. And my patients who come to me, and by the way, I do offer sessions, a few sessions a week for those who are interested, but online. But people come to me, who have already been in relationship a long time, and maybe they've raised their children already, and then the mate doesn't understand them. But they're at that position. It's not a new relationship. It's a really, longer relationship. And then what do you do with the mate who doesn't understand? And it's very important to have compassion for that, because what I've seen over the years is that you can educate a lot of your mates who don't understand. And they just feel things that you would never even imagine. Like empaths sometimes like to sleep alone. And that's a point of contention in a couple, because the one who's non-empath loves to be together. So what do you do in cases like that? How do you talk about it in a loving way? How do you resolve it? So there are different kinds of conversations. And certainly as a therapist, I can help them to talk about it, because I've a lot of experience with that. And so it's important, depending on your situation, if you want to be in a relationship and your mate doesn't understand at the moment, then give them the Empath Survival Guide. Just give them the first 2 pages. There's a 20-question self-assessment test there if you're an empath. And they might just want to read the questions to see who you are. to get a sense of who you are. And maybe you've been married for 30 years and maybe they don't know this aspect of yourself. Isn't that interesting? And so then they can learn. You see, you want to stay positive and very patient with people when you're teaching them this, especially partners. And they feel lonely or rejected if you don't sleep with them every single night. And so it's you have to deal with their where they're coming from too. So it's so you talk about sensitive topics, but you can do it lovingly and work things out.
You said something that I felt really activated by. You talked about it took you quite some time to learn to assert your own needs. And it never occurred to me, but of course it would make sense that because as empaths, we are so highly attuned to the experience of the other person, it would make sense that we would decenter or deprioritize ourselves and our needs in that relational dynamic. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you're also talking about how, if we're so deeply attuned perhaps to the minute and micro expressions and flavors in our partner's response, we're not maybe even actually hearing them or asking the right questions, or I'm hearing that there's so many ways to approach this conversation. And I think my favorite takeaway from our time together today is really, even being an empath is not a one size fits all experience. And engaging and in being in relationship with either other empaths or people who do not identify as empaths, also seeing each individual person that we are in relation to as an individual. There's the whole spectrum of humanity is not a one size fits all experience. And I think that I also have made the mistake of lumping empaths into sort of like a group or a category, because I think we often feel so alone in our experience. When we finally find each other, we're eager to have that connection in the community. But also, a part of a healthy community is recognizing each individual for who they are. And I have to tell you that even as a lifelong fan of your work, I have learned so much in this conversation. I feel like there's so much that I personally am taking away, and I feel enriched by this conversation in a way that I'm like, wow, I want to go back and read these again. Maybe there's something I can hear from a different point and different perspective. Speaking of which, Dr. Orloff, I would love if you could tell listeners, where can they get your books? Where can they connect with your work, take your classes, have a session with you? How can people connect even more directly to your genius of empathy?
Yes, I have an empath support newsletter. If you go on drjudithorloff.com, you can sign up for it. And it's about once a month where I send out various strategies on how to really become an empowered empath. So you could sign up for that. And my lecture schedule is there. You can click on patient appointments if you would like to have a session with me online. So just go to drjudithorloff.com. And for those of you who are healthcare practitioners, I wanted to mention this. I have an audio program called Becoming an Intuitive Healer, which could be very useful for you, to learn how to bring intuition and empathy and being an empath into your clinical work. So that could be, and I give workshops on that. So that's really important when you get that information, and you can help your patients even more.
Wow. Dr. Orloff, I could speak to you all day. In this moment, I have 30 more questions that I'm like, wait, I should have put this in. So I hope one day you'll come back for a part 2. But in the meantime, is there any final word you'd like to leave listeners with to support them in their path of deeper self-understanding?
Well, just be really gentle with yourself and go slow. Don't rush. Enjoy your life. Look around. Just love is all there is, really, when you get down to it. And develop your empath self. Learn how to protect your energy. Learn how to be centered. Learn how to, not be thrown off by all of the different energies in the world. It's a wonderful adventure, and I hope you can enjoy it along the way. I really enjoy it. I would never give it up. Oh my God, this is one of the most fantastic things that's ever happened to me at this point. I see it. So, and help your children. Help your children embrace their empathy and their intuition and their dreams. Now help your children. That's important.
Oh, Dr. Orloff, thank you so much for every brave choice and decision you've ever made, for every time that you have heard the intuitive beckoning and taken action so that the world could benefit from the things that you bring into it. It is such a privilege and such a joy to connect with you. And I have to say, my heart is so full to be able to finally have a conversation with you directly. And I would love to thank you for your time and energy in being here with us today and sharing your voice and your brilliance, because I truly think this conversation will help so many.
Oh, you're most welcome. I've really enjoyed our time together.
That is a very high compliment from you. Well, there you have it, blessed babes. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode. And I would love if we could take a moment to send this week's subject, Dr. Orloff, some love, sweetness, and positivity as she continues to help pave a path forward for empaths to be empowered in our gifts and to know and love ourselves more deeply. If you're interested in connecting with me, you can find me on all socials at the Zoey Greco. Submit your questions to zoegreco.com/hotline. You can find me everywhere you know you like to listen. And of course, I want to conclude by reminding you that you are important, you matter, and you are perfect exactly as you are. I love you. Your spirit guides love you. Dr. Orloff loves you, and the universe loves you. So until next time, keep answering the call of your higher self. Bye, friends.